2024 has been a year of mixed fortunes for the African continent. More than a dozen countries in Africa staged presidential, parliamentary and local elections, while some of Africa's long-time dominant ruling parties retained power. In others, incumbents went down in surprising and crushing defeats. The Russia-Ukraine war also had a huge impact on Africa's food chain, while climate change still remains a tough equation to handle. Governments of the continent also faced security shocks as Al-Shabaab terrorized the Horn of Africa. Islamists from the Sahel posed a threat in West Africa, while the Rwanda DRC crisis reached boiling point. In the midst of all this, how would the continent cope in the year 2025, especially with crucial elections in Cameroon? My guest will break down the developments on this and more in this edition of the program. Stay with us. My guest is an international democracy expert who has organized and advised international election observation missions in Benin, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Liberia, Madagascar, Mali, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. He has also designed and supervised country-specific democracy support programs with civic organizations, political parties, and legislative bodies in several African countries. He recently designed and helped launch the African Statesmen Initiative, which is a program aimed at facilitating political transition in Africa by encouraging former democratic heads of states to stay engaged in humanitarian issues, conflict mediation, public health, as well as key sectors of political, economic, and human development on the continent. As an expert on democracy in Africa, he makes frequent guest appearances on major radio and television networks. He holds a licence en droit from University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, a master's degree in international law from Harvard Law School, and a PhD in political science from Boston University in the United States. He is an adjunct faculty at the African Center for Strategic Studies and a former adjunct professor of African politics and government at Georgetown University. He is also a humanitarian and author of several books. Additionally, he volunteers as a goodwill ambassador for Ukraine on the Grain from Ukraine initiative. Join me to welcome Dr. Christopher Fomunyo, the African Programs Director at the National Democratic Institute. Hello, Dr. Fomunyo. Thank you for talking to In-Depth once again, and Happy New Year in advance.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for giving me this opportunity to wish a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all your televiewers and all of our compatriots.
All right, thank you very much. We would like to begin the program with some high-profile activities which you carried out. The last quarter of the year 2024 was a very busy one for you as you toured so many countries, both in Europe and across the African continent. But let's start first with Ukraine, where you were named as the Grain Ambassador of the World by the President of Ukraine. What motivated you to accept this nomination?
Well, to provide some context to this, you may be aware, or your viewers may be aware, of the fact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine occurred in February 2022. And as a result of that, there was a dramatic increase in food prices around the world, and a sense that a number of countries that could have benefited from food production from Ukraine were going to be deprived of that opportunity. And so President Zelensky, with the Russians, with United Nations and Turkish mediation, agreed to the Black Sea Agreement, which allowed both Ukraine and Russia to export grain through the Black Sea, despite the hostilities of the conflict. And in November of 2022, President Zelensky launched the International Coordination Group to Prevent Hunger around the world, which was an effort that would allow Ukraine to continue its humanitarian contributions in terms of providing grain to the most needy populations around the world. So I'm in my second year of that ambassadorship, and I accepted that responsibility, first because as a humanitarian, you have to feel for being able to be in a position to facilitate remedies or relief being sent to populations in need, but also because you look at a country like Ukraine, you have a sense of what it's going through, and your gut feeling is to root for the underdog in that conflict and to make sure that its voice and its humanitarian efforts can be felt around the globe.
You also participated in the Grain for World Forum in Ukraine. How important was that event in ensuring food security, particularly for the African continent?
Well, this was my second participation in the Global Food Security Summit in Kyiv, in Ukraine. The first one was in November 2023. And then just last month, I was in Kyiv for the second summit. And what I saw in this second summit was an increase in the number of countries that are willing to make donations to this initiative, to keep the initiative going, a determination on the part of President Zelensky and the government of people of Ukraine to continue to help feed the world, and also an specific outreach by President Zelensky to journalists from Africa and Latin America. And in fact, I had the privilege of facilitating or moderating an exchange which went for over 1 hour, 15 minutes between President Zelensky himself and journalists from Africa and Latin America. And fortunately, there was even one journalist from Cameroon in that team. And what I saw was a determination to make sure that this initiative can continue to thrive. What I also saw is the fact that the list of African countries that are in need or at risk of food insecurity continues to grow. Unfortunately, you may be aware that the Food and Agriculture Organization, that's part of the United Nations system, as well as the World Food Program, have made projections that in the first half of 2025, food insecurity would be magnified both in magnitude and in severity in 22 countries around the world. And many of those countries happen to be on the African continent because of the issues that we have with climate change, because of some of the conflicts that are impacting countries and agricultural lands, and just because of the nature of our agriculture, which for the most part is still very rudimentary. And so I feel that this initiative is continuing to have impact across the African continent.
Now, talking about impact, how can you measure up that impact on the African continent since it was launched?
Well, you have to look at the countries that have benefited from the initiative thus far. And I'm happy to report that over 200,000 tons of grain have been delivered through this initiative to various countries in Africa, but even some in the Middle East. There have been deliveries to Yemen, to Gaza, to Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Kenya, Malawi, even northern Nigeria because of the Boko Haram crisis, as well as Mauritania. And so this is confirmation that the populations that were exposed or at risk of famine or hunger, at least were able to benefit directly from the assistance from Ukraine. And this is something that is worth supporting. Not that that should become the policy for the continent, no, but as a stopgap, immediate-term relief effort for the populations that are most at risk.
Now, Ukraine is a country that has been affected by war as a result of the clash with Russia, but yet it still has the mindset of trying to ease access to grains for African countries and others across the world. What lessons can Africa pick out from it, knowing fully well that Africa is also rich in the agriculture sector, but in most areas of conflict, food is very difficult to come by?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and something that has been an eye-opener for me as well. Because we have to keep in mind that prior to the conflict, Ukraine was the 5th largest producer of grain in the world. And that by itself should be soul-searching for African countries. Because we on the continent have got well over 30% of arable land in the world. In fact, some statistics say that percentage could be as high as 60, depending on how it's calculated. We have the most arable concentration of arable land in the world, but yet in some cases, we're faced with challenges feeding our own populations in various countries or feeding neighboring countries that are at risk just because we haven't industrialized our agriculture. We also have not provided, we also have not invested in the infrastructure that can sustain transportation of food crops from one country to the other. And we haven't opened up our continental markets to be able to import products from neighboring countries. And so as I go through this ambassadorship relationship with Ukraine on the Grain from Ukraine initiative, I'm keeping my eyes wide open. I'm learning, drawing a lot of lessons. I'm also seeing how Ukraine is coping with the fact that it's facing war, but at the same time able to meet its humanitarian obligations to the world. It's industrialized its agriculture to the point of being able to export, not just to Africa or the Middle East, but even to Asia and Latin America. My hope is that when this war is over, that African countries will be able to take advantage of Ukraine's experience to also bolster their own agriculture and develop bilateral relationships that can allow them to benefit from the technological investments that Ukraine has made in its agricultural sector, as well as in other sectors as well, even including sectors as sensitive as security.
Now, still as part of your high-profile tour in the last quarter of the year, you were also in Canada, where you addressed the Canadian Parliament, and you urged the Parliament to enhance capacity building for Africa's self-sufficiency. How timely is that call?
Well, I think it's very timely. And first, I was really humbled to be invited by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of the Canadian Parliament to testify as Canada is going through a process of reviewing its policy towards Africa. And the point that I really tried to make was that Africa is 1.5 billion people. It is projected that that population would grow to 2.5 billion in the next 20 years, 25 years, which is a very short period of time. And that by 2050, 25% of the world's population will be African, which means that 1 of every 4 people on the planet will be from our continent. And so this is a moment for various countries to properly align their relationships with Africa in a way that could be mutually beneficial to the continent as well as to themselves. And so when I take, for example, the issue of agriculture that we were talking about, a country such as Canada has got sufficient technology that can help Africa industrialize its agriculture. Even the African Union, in one of its heads of states summit, adopted a resolution that said that African countries should invest a minimum of 10% of their GDP in the agricultural sector, which means that the demand is there and there's a recognition that Africa is not yet tapping into the maximum capacity of its agricultural potential. Mm-hmm. If a country such as Canada were to invest in partnerships that could allow Africa to industrialize its agriculture, that will be a win-win investment. And that constitutes some of the messaging that I tried to put across in my testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I also talked about the fact that democratization and good governance are at the key, they're front and center in terms of how African countries develop. Because issues of transparency, accountability, representation, inclusion, all of these issues can only be dealt with when countries are fully democratic or where they've embraced democratic governance. And a country like Canada that has an experience to share and doesn't have the baggage that some other Western countries have is well positioned to be able to play a key role in its relationship with the continent going forward. And I was really delighted with the kind of welcome that I received from the Canadian senators and also some of the officials that I had the opportunity to meet with in the Canadian Foreign Ministry or in Global Affairs Canada, as their foreign ministry is called, up in Ottawa.
All right. The last time we spoke, you decried democratic backslide on the African continent, but the year 2024 has seen significant peaceful elections across the country, elections which of course has marked human existence. When we look at Senegal, Botswana, and recently Ghana, how positive is this for democracy in Africa, particularly at a time when the continent is still grappling with political instability?
That's really an excellent question because, of course, you know, with 54 countries across the continent, we're always going to be dealing with a mixed bag of successes and challenges. I think the beginning of the year was pretty difficult with the backsliding, but fortunately, the continent ended the year on a high with the trajectory looking up and with the hope that it could do better as we roll over into 2025. The elections earlier this year, presidential elections in Senegal in March, legislative elections in November, went extremely well. And I think Senegal then joined the list of the countries you cited, Ghana, Botswana, and I would add to that list Mauritius. In the Indian Ocean. I would also add Namibia, where a woman just got elected president of the country. You look at those 5 stories and you say there's quite some success here, there's something to build on. And it's a reaffirmation that given the right opportunity, Africans are able to conduct and participate in peaceful, meaningful, credible elections. And that's really a shot in the arm for Democrats across the entire continent.
Now, what, in your view, accounted for the positive outcome of these elections in these countries?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's the level of awareness and the level of engagement by citizens in their own elections. In each one of these countries, the citizens took ownership of their electoral process. Even when they had demonstrations in Senegal, for example, there were demonstrations to say that the constitution must be respected and elections must hold on time. When they had demonstrations in Ghana, there were also demonstrations to say we want peaceful, inclusive elections. We want the Electoral Commission to perform in a transparent, non-partisan manner. And so in each one of these countries, citizens took ownership of their electoral process, and that could be seen in the high level of participation as well as in efforts that were led by citizens to make sure that the elections were transparent and were credible. Secondly, we also saw that in each one of these countries, the institutions worked. The courts were very neutral and independent in their rulings. The election management bodies, the electoral commissions, performed their tasks very transparently, and that built and enhanced citizen confidence that their votes would count. And I think a combination of this and other factors would explain why these countries were able to hold meaningful elections and why there's reason for hope, given that in various opinion polls that have been conducted by African organizations, such as Afrobarometer, those polls continue to indicate that well over 70% of Africans believe in democracy and the processes that strengthen and deepen democracy in our respective countries.
Now, we know that the National Democratic Institute has been very active on the continent this year. Can you take us through some of the actions carried out by the National Democratic Institute in these countries and others to promote and enforce democratic principles on the continent?
Yeah, in fact, in many of these countries, we've had long-lasting relationships where we've worked side by side with our partners in civil society and in legislative bodies and with political parties across the board to help them participate more actively in electoral processes. And I would also, your question also gives me the opportunity to say that in many of these countries, we have realized that there is existence of enough political will to make good elections happen. And so rather than send a few international observers who may not be able to cover many of the polling sites in the country, we have determined to invest our resources, our know-how in supporting local organizations. And when you go through, whether it's Senegal or Ghana, for the West African countries, we have invested in supporting citizens who have built coalitions of citizens observers. Those coalitions have allowed them to recruit and train thousands of their fellow citizens who are then deployed to monitor the electoral process, even right from the campaign period, to report regularly on those processes even before election day. And then on election day, to deploy thousands of independent citizen observers across their respective countries. What we've seen also is that these independent observers, these citizen observers, have been able to monitor the elections and report accurately on what happens at the polling sites. And I'm really happy to report that across many African countries today, whether it's COSC in Senegal, or CDD Ghana and CODEO in Ghana, or Yaga Africa in Nigeria, or EHON in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, and even in Kenya, you now have citizen observation missions that deploy thousands of their own citizens across polling sites on the election day, and who are able to track the performance of the election commission or the election management body. And in each one of these countries, ordinary citizens have been able to organize parallel results and vote tabulation processes that have allowed them to track the veracity of election results, and even in some cases to project what the outcomes could be based on real data collected at polling sites on election day. And this exercise has helped to raise the performance of the Election Commission. It has also helped to give confidence to citizens that their votes would count. And it has allowed the stakeholders, the candidates and the political parties to be confident that the work of the Independent Election Commission can be verified, independently verified by citizen organizations. And that explains why increasingly in country after country, we saw that in Nigeria in 2023, we saw that in Senegal at the beginning of this year in March, and we recently saw that in Ghana in December, that even candidates that have lost elections, once they are convinced that the election results that have been announced by the Election Commission are a true reflection of what happened on election day. Once they've gotten confirmation from the citizen observer groups that the work of the Election Commission was thorough and truthful and impartial, they've been very quick in accepting their losses, and that has allowed those countries to have very smooth transitions. So I look back at the partnerships that NDI has developed over the years and continue to sustain across the continent. I look back at the fact that NDI presently has offices in 18 countries on the African continent and in 60 countries around the world. And I'm really gratified with the confidence that democracy activists, democratic leaders, and other partners have in the work that we do and in the support that we provide to make sure that citizens can work hard to consolidate their democratic processes and practices.
Now, in the heart of this work, there could have been some challenges which the NDI faced. What could be some of these challenges, and how did you scale over them?
Well, some of the challenges that we face, for example, have to do with being able to establish relationships with the election commissions or with the election management bodies. As you may be aware, in many countries, these entities tend to be very, I would say, very much eager to preserve, very protective. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Very protective of their own information on how they function. Whereas with the new methodologies that have been developed around parallel vote tabulations, for example, you need to have access to the data that the Election Commission has. You need to have access to data in terms of number of registered voters, the number of polling stations around the country. You need to have that kind of information in advance in order to be able to do a statistical sampling that will be representative of the national electorate, along the lines of which you can then deploy domestic observers to a statistically selected sample of polling sites. And so if you don't have that kind of trustworthy relationship with election commissions, it becomes very difficult to do your work in a way that is thorough, in a way that is scientific, and in a way that can gain the confidence of all of the stakeholders. And what we've tried to do to overcome those kinds of challenges is to begin those engagements way in advance of election day or even the election year, so that those actors, those leaders who manage those institutions can have a sense and a comfort level that the information is being required to help the country conduct meaningful elections and for no other purpose. And also to convince them to realize that when citizens engage in the electoral process in positive ways, they become true partners even to the election administration or to the election management body. And that partnership can only be for the good of the country, and it's in everybody's interest to be transparent about the data that they can have. And I can assure you that in Senegal, in Ghana, in Namibia, in South Africa, we should talk also about South Africa, in those countries where we've had meaningful relationships, those relationships have really paid off and have helped the countries to consolidate their democratic and electoral processes.
2025 will be an election year on the African continent, and two countries are on the spotlight. We have Ivory Coast and Cameroon. How challenging a test are these two countries for democracy as we look towards elections in these countries?
Well, we have to be honest to acknowledge that it will be quite challenging for both countries. And I also think that's an important message to convey, so that the various stakeholders can redouble their efforts to overcome the challenges that may lie ahead, so that they don't become complicit or they don't approach the electoral process with complacency, just imagining that everything would go smoothly. Cote d'Ivoire, as we know, had a very difficult election year in 2010. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, it was able to do better in 2015. And even in 2020, despite some incidents of violence, that the electoral process overall was not as challenging as it was in 2010. There has been a lot of work done in Cote d'Ivoire in the past 4 years. And I would say that with support from the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is part of the U.S. government, NDI, and a number of other organizations have worked with Ivorian partners on issues of rebuilding social cohesion in the country and going to some of the communities that experienced a lot of violence in the past and working to reconcile citizens at the grassroots level. I have a sense that those efforts are beginning to bear fruit, and my hope is that going into 2025, Cote d'Ivoire will be well positioned to organize peaceful and inclusive elections that can allow the candidates to all participate and citizens to be able to make informed choices about how their votes should be cast. In the case of our own country, Cameroon, we must admit that we have a history of difficult elections. And I think part of the reason is that we haven't invested enough in making our elections inclusive and peaceful and transparent way in advance of election year. By this point in time, ELECAM, which is the election management body, needs to be leaning over backwards to build confidence amongst the stakeholders in political parties in terms of its performance and its ability to be non-partisan and transparent in the way in which it conducts its activities. ELECAM should also be leaning over backwards in terms of engaging civil society organizations so that, and sharing with civil society organizations its own efforts, because many of these organizations are very grassroots based. They talk to other citizens on a regular basis. And because they are seen as non-partisan, they're more able to communicate with citizens in a way that can enhance citizen confidence in the electoral process. I think those are some of the steps that ELECAM should be taking vis-a-vis political parties and vis-a-vis civil society organizations. ELECAM should also be investing in engaging with the media, with journalists, to proactively tell them what is being done and what is being planned, so that journalists can report accurately on the electoral process. And we must remind ourselves that elections are not just about what happens on election day. Mm-hmm. They are about an entire process which begins with voter registration, printing and distribution of voter cards, determination of polling sites, making that information available to voters so they know in advance where their names are and where they'll be voting, and then having all the material that is required so that by the time we get to election day, everyone is confident that election day will go well, that candidates would have campaigned freely across the country and had the opportunity to engage with voters, and that by the time we get to election day, people will be confident that all the steps have been taken to make the electoral process meaningful and credible, and that, of course, with what transpires on election day, the votes will be counted and announced at the polling sites, as has become the habit across the continent, and that the tabulation of results would also be done in a transparent way so that whoever is announced as the victor will be so seen by the majority of citizens who would have had confidence that that process has been transparent and meaningful. So I would send out this message to both countries as a way of encouraging each and everyone to put their best foot forward and to redouble their efforts to make sure that there's no backsliding when it comes to elections in these two very important countries.
The election outcomes in countries like Senegal, Botswana, and Ghana has really attracted attention in Cameroon, with some political actors, wishing that there could be a change in leadership here in Cameroon. But I want to ask you the question: is it feasible for Cameroonians to turn the page on a new leadership in 2025?
Well, with elections, especially elections that are well organized, you cannot predict the outcome in advance. And we have seen in Botswana, for example, that the ruling party, the BDF, which had ruled the country for 58 years, lost the elections both at the presidential and at the legislative levels. It was a landslide for the opposition parties. And the incumbent government accepted the outcome because everyone saw how transparent the elections were. And Botswana has made a peaceful transition. We also saw in Senegal that despite the strength of the ruling party before the last elections, the ruling party actually lost. And this will be the third time in Senegalese history that the ruling party has lost an election. President Abdoulaye Wade, who was an opposition leader with the PDS, defeated the Socialist Party in 2000, and President Abdou Diouf at the time acknowledged defeat, and Senegal had a very smooth transition. In 2012, Macky Sall, who was an opposition leader at the time with the APR, defeated Abdoulaye Wade of the PDS, and the country had a smooth transition. And so it's incumbent on everybody who considers themselves a Democrat to acknowledge the fact that when you go into an election, your party can win just as your party can lose. And that irrespective of the longevity that your party has had in office, if citizens come to the conclusion that your time is over, it is important that that desire on the part of citizens be respected. And so you have to keep an open mind. And everybody who considers themselves a Democrat must keep an open mind, because in countries where parties have been quite entrenched, even more entrenched than the ruling party in Cameroon, those parties have lost elections and have accepted the outcome. And so there's no reason to imagine that a well-conducted election couldn't result in one outcome or the other. And my word of encouragement is for everybody to be prepared, should the elections be properly conducted, to accept the outcome.
Now, let's talk about President Paul Biya, who has been in power for 42 years now. He is past the 90-year market age, but still there has been calls from CPDM militants and their allies for him to be the candidate in the 2025 presidential elections. What do you make of these calls?
Well, it is up to the CPDM and his party to go through their internal politics and to determine for themselves the candidate that they think is the best candidate to lead Cameroon in the 21st century at this time of major global competition across the continent and multiple domestic crises that the country faces. I could be cynical and say, like everyone else, let a 92-year-old candidate be in the race so the entire country and the world can see that he's no longer able to campaign across all 10 regions of the country, that he's not able to articulate his message, and so he could be beaten hands down by other more able and more competent candidates. But that's not my call. And also, I'm human. And I've had grandparents in my youth. And I've seen them when they were 80, when they were 85, when they were 90, and even beyond. And we all know that with the challenges that Cameroon faces today, the country needs a leader who would be awake and hardworking on a 24 hours, 7 days a week basis. But if the party makes its choice, that will be their choice, and I think they will be prepared to live with the consequences.
Some political parties, civil society organizations, and even press organs fancy you to be Cameroon's next president. If requested, would you, Dr. Christopher Fomunyo, run for the 2025 presidential elections?
Well, let me first say that I'm humbled by that thought, and it could be flattery, but I want to thank them, and I hope that is sincere on their part, because I can imagine from some of the messages that I get from fellow compatriots that they realize the challenges that the country faces. They realize that the democratic process in the country is broken, that the security situation in the extreme north with Boko Haram requires vigorous action, that the crisis or conflict in the southwest and northwest regions of the country warrant maximum attention and resolution. They look at some of the things that I do around the world or across Africa and have an appreciation that were I to join efforts with other compatriots, that we could lift our country into a better place than it is today. However, I think the subject matter is still premature, that the alignment isn't quite there, but I feel honored that some of my competitors think along those lines. There's multiple ways in which I could continue to make a contribution to lift up our country from the current situation in which it finds itself.
What would you say is the ideal profile of the president you want to see in Cameroon after 2025?
Well, interestingly, in 2013, well over 10 years ago, when I wrote a little brochure, The Cameroon of Tomorrow, I was already talking about the kind of profile that I would see for a post-Biya Cameroon or a post-Biya presidency. And little did I know that in the past 10 years, in the 10 years since then, the country's situation would even have worsened today than it was in 2013. And when I look at where the country is today, I can only say in summary, I mean, you can go through a long list of criteria, but I can say in summary that the country needs a strong visionary leader who can undertake massive reforms of the multiple sectors that are currently broken and that are in disrepair across the country. We need a leader who can reconcile, who can embrace national reconciliation as a national priority, just given the excessive polarization that we see in Cameroon, the excessive fragmentation that we see, the disaffection between even citizens and the state, the lack of functionality of various state institutions, that reconciliation is going to be a top priority. And then you need a leader, thirdly, who can rebuild our communities, our regions, and who can rebuild the country, who can lift it up not just at the level of where it was even 10, 20 years ago, but lift it up to be a leading nation on the African continent and a major actor on the global stage. And I would say that a leader who can meet these three criteria would be my preferred choice for the next president of Cameroon. Able to reform massively, able to reconcile across the board, and able to rebuild. Those are the 3 R's on which I continue and would continue to pin my hope for the Cameroon of tomorrow.
Now, the government of Cameroon in recent times has faced criticisms from within, particularly from some regime officials. A case in point is the police boss Martin Bangagele, as well as Senator Belamoki Charles, who all raised serious concerns about the bad state of roads in the country. What is your take on CPDM cadre taking on their comrades who are in government?
They have to, because patriotism requires that you put country before party. You put the nation before party. And I salute their courage. I salute the distinguished Senator Belamoki for his courage on the Senate floor. That's a voice that should be heeded. That's a gentleman who is very poised, who is not radical, who is very thoughtful, who is very connected to his constituency. And when he speaks out, the country should listen. When the head of the national, the delegate of national security speaks out, for goodness sakes, it's been a call too late. While I could say, where has he been all this while, I praise him for having the courage to speak out and to say some of the things that many of us have been saying for decades. Things are not right. And I would implore, I would hope that decision makers within their own party, for once, can listen even to voices coming from within.
Now, let's talk about the Anglophone crisis. What do you make of it 8 years after?
It's very sad, because 8 years ago, in 2017, in 2018, I was out there with many others. Many of us were out there saying force is not the way to go, saying dialogue, negotiations should happen, saying the grievances are legitimate and are real and should be dealt with in a very honest manner, and that the root causes of these grievances should be looked into. And of course, fast forward to today, we've lost tens of thousands of lives, innocent lives of citizens and of people in uniform. We have close to 100,000 refugees in Nigeria and other countries. We have well over 800,000 internally displaced persons, some who have left their localities, their divisions to the regional headquarters, others who have gone outside of the regions. We've caused tremendous fragmentation. Villages have been burned down. And the historians have not even started writing about the impact of this crisis. And had the more reasonable voices been heeded to at the time, back then, we wouldn't be where we are today. Tremendous damage has been done because of this conflict. And I still feel that until we sit around the table and deal with the root causes, until we bring into the room the people who have been the most aggrieved and most impacted by this conflict, until we give them voice to speak for themselves and say precisely what it is they want, we're not going to be able to resolve this crisis. And I would just say today, honestly, like I said 5, 7, 8 years ago, that no government in the world has ever benefited from a frozen conflict with its own citizenry. We should not assume that even if the guns stopped firing, the conflict would have been resolved. We have to provide a platform, an opening to talk about these grievances openly and to build consensus around the outcome. Or else we're just putting a Band-Aid, and 5, 10, 15 years down the road, another conflict would emerge, some of which will be driven by the grievances that have now been developed over the past 7 years. And that will become the narrative of the history of that country. And so my hope is that people, like-minded people, including people in government, who know that the root causes are legitimate, would do all they can for us to resolve this conflict through negotiations.
All right, we have come to the end of the program, but before we go, what message do you have for Cameroonians as they approach the months ahead?
Well, I know that the circumstances are extremely difficult back home. I understand and I feel the challenges that people go through on a daily basis with the ability to feed themselves, to send kids to school, the sense of insecurity that prevails in a number of our regions. I feel the stress that fellow compatriots go through. And I would say to them, despite these challenges, not to lose hope, to stay resilient, to keep faith, because better days are ahead. And at a period like this, to spend the time with family and friends through Christmas and into the new year, and be thankful that despite all of these challenges, we're able to see the new year. And so this is an opportunity for me to wish them a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and to send a message of hope that all is not lost and that Cameroon's better days are still ahead of us.
Thank you very much
for giving me this opportunity, and I wish you and your colleagues all the best for 2025.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher Fomunyo. We are very honored to have you on the program once again. We are indeed very glad. Thank you very much, and do have a great end of the year and a great 2025.
Thank you.
And to you, televiewers, it was a pleasure being with you in this edition of the program In Depth. Until next time, it's bye-bye.